Welcome to everyone for joining our webinar today. It's a pleasure to be hosting today's topic, Boards and Nature and the Evolving Landscape for Directors' Duties. I'm very pleased to be introducing our speakers today. I'm Candice Dott, and I head up our global market engagement at the TNFD Secretariat. I'm usually based in South Africa, in Johannesburg. Today, I'm actually dialing in from London, but I'm looking forward to today's presentation. Nature is now considered a strategic risk management and governance issue for companies and financial institutions. Physical and transition risks are materializing with greater frequency and severity, and customer expectations are shifting, with investors asking more questions and regulators moving forward with new nature-related corporate reporting requirements. In today's webinar, we will cover how directors' duties are evolving to include nature-related issues and the role of the TNFD recommendations and related guidance and how that can help support directors' duties. And I would like to just cover off a few digital housekeeping points before we introduce our speakers. Because we are doing this call over Zoom today, please, I recommend you put Zoom into speaker view for the best experience. That certainly helps. The session has and will be recorded, so it will be available as a recording after this on our TNFD website. And given the number of participants, we will have had to disable the microphones, but we welcome and deeply encourage your use of the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom experience where you can ask your questions. So please interact with us. We will be including your questions and integrating them hopefully into the questions that the panelists will be covering, as well as focusing some dedicated time with audience questions to our panelists. I am going to welcome our speakers who are joining me today. Firstly, if I can start with Sarah Barker, who's Managing Director at Pollination Law. Sarah leads the Climate and Sustainability Risk Governance team. She was previously a partner at the Asia Pacific's largest commercial law firm, Minter Ellison. And Sarah has more than 25 years of experience as a corporate lawyer and is regarded one of the world's foremost experts on climate change governance, finance, and liability risks. Sarah is also the co-chair of the World Economic Forum's Climate Governance Community of Experts, and she brings practical expertise as well as experienced non-executive director experience, having recently completed 2 terms on the board of one of Australia's largest pension funds. Welcome, Sarah. I'm going to introduce Helle Jorgensen, who is the CEO and co-founder and founder of Competent Boards. Helle is a business lawyer, an accountant by training. She was a partner at PwC for many years, based in Europe, and also latter years in the US. She serves as the NASDAQ Center for Board Excellence and on the World Economic Forum Expert Network and the Accounting for Sustainability A4S, which was established by His Majesty the King Charles III, amongst other roles. Helle is also an internationally recognized expert on sustainable business practices with over 30 years of experience turning environmental, social, and governance risks into innovative and profitable business opportunities. In addition to Helle running Competent Boards, she's also founded a number of other brainchildren, including the world's first green account, the first integrated report, and the first holistic supply chain program, as well as a number of other business solutions. Helle is originally from Denmark. She now lives in Canada. And as I mentioned at the beginning, she founded the Competent Boards with a handful of key business stakeholders and leaders. Welcome, Helle. And Cynthia, Cynthia Williams, who joins us as the Executive Director of the Commonwealth Climate and Law Initiative. Professor Cynthia is the Executive Director of CCLI and the Roscoe C. O'Brien Chair in Law at the Indiana University Maurer School of Law. Professor Williams writes in the areas of securities law, corporate responsibility, comparative corporate governance, and regulatory theory, and is often in interdisciplinary collaborations with professors in anthropology, economic sociology, and organizational psychology. She has lectured and taught in various jurisdictions all over the world, and Cynthia also engages in policy work through her board membership in the Climate Bonds Initiative. And last but not least, Tony Goldner, who is the Executive Director of the TNFD Secretariat, who will be helping manage today's discussion. And without further ado, I would like to hand over to Tony to start our discussions today. And welcome everyone to the session.
Great, thanks so much, Candice. Very much looking forward to this discussion, and it looks like we've got about 225, 230 people online, which is terrific. Great to see so much interest, and I hope this conversation is helpful for those of you serving as in board positions or advising board executive directors, non-executive directors on these issues. So let's dive straight in. I think what would be helpful, maybe if I can start with you, Cynthia, is just to sort of create a baseline for the conversation. Obviously, as Candice mentioned, nature is sort of rising up the agenda, certainly as a risk issue for companies. But maybe you can give us a quick recap on where does climate and nature issues fit into director responsibilities in the current landscape? What are the legal responsibilities, and what are the expectations on boards and boards of directors today around sustainability issues, and where does nature fit into that?
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you for this opportunity. If you might advance the slide. First of all, very briefly, as probably everyone on this call recognizes, it's understood that nature underpins a very large percentage of the economic value of products in today's world. That this study, PwC's research done in conjunction with the World Economic Forum, has concluded that $58 trillion of economic value, 55% of the world's GDP, is either moderately or highly dependent on nature. And we can think of industries and sectors such as agriculture, forestry, fisheries, food, beverage, and tobacco and construction, which are 100% based on natural products. So for everyone involved in those industries and other industries that are either directly or indirectly affected by nature and biodiversity loss and degradation, climate risk interacts with biodiversity loss, and these risks are localized. They're specific to different industries and sectors, geographies, and supply chain locations. So every board needs to have some insights into what their nature dependencies are and how to mitigate those risks. So if you wouldn't mind going on to the next slide, I've been involved with the Commonwealth Climate and Law Initiative almost since its inception in 2016. And one of the things that's been surprising to us is the extent to which fiduciary obligations of boards and officers are consistent across jurisdictions, either in civil law jurisdictions or in common law or Commonwealth jurisdictions, as CCLI sets out initially to evaluate. And directors generally have duties to act with prudence and care and loyalty. Loyalty is to put the interests of their company first, and care is to make reasonable decisions based on information that is reasonably available, and to understand when developing strategy, oversight of the company's management, and disclosure, what are the relevant risks that can affect strategy, oversight, and disclosure. 10 years ago, AI was unlikely to be on any board agenda. Today, it should be on every board agenda. Why? Because risks change as technologies change, and as our understanding of science changes. Today, cybersecurity is also on the agenda of every thoughtful board because of changes in the geopolitical landscape. So too with nature. We see an evolving understanding of the economic significance of nature across industries. And moreover, we see that investors are recognizing those economic significant implications. We see emerging litigation. We see emerging regulation, including in the EU, the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, which is going to have not only EU companies, but non-EU companies evaluating and disclosing their human rights and environmental risks. And we see investors specifically now coming together to identify biodiversity risk and to ask companies, what are you doing and how are you managing these risks in your company? Helle is going to tell us about opportunities from biodiversity and nature. Sarah will likely tell us more about risks. But I wanted to show one more slide on dependencies. And I'm not going to spend a large amount of time on this slide, but only to suggest that in many industries, nature is providing the raw materials that are being, transformed into products for sale. In many other areas of the world and industries, nature is providing what are called ecosystem services, affecting the cleanliness of water, affecting floods, affecting soil quality, where is, mitigation, storm mitigation. And also, we depend, and some countries specifically depend on nature as one of their major industries, tourism. Austria, a country I know well. So this is no longer, and happily no longer thought of as external to the financial interests of companies and boards. So what should boards be doing? And this is the last slide. Understanding what their risks are and mitigating them as necessary. Is the management team at your company assessing nature and biodiversity dependencies and impacts? Are they measuring those dependencies and impacts, disclosing them as necessary, depending on the jurisdictions? Does the organization have any kind of strategy for understanding and mitigating its dependencies? Does the board receive information on these matters? And does the board have the expertise it needs to evaluate? If not, what experts does the board need to rely upon? And answering these questions, asking these questions and answering these questions is fundamental to the board's exercise of its duties of care and loyalty. It's really very simple. When I'm teaching this to my students, I teach one of the major cases in the United States where a board was found liable for not exercising its duty of care. And I ask my students, what should the board have done? And the answer is really very simple. They should have asked questions and then evaluated the information that they received. And that's the end of my slides.
Thanks so much, Cynthia. It's a terrific foundation for the discussion. And you very neatly, I think, pointed to ecosystem services and business and finance's dependence on ecosystem services. That's really a foundational part of the TNFD guidance that we've developed. The future cash flow generation resilience, or the ability of a business to generate cash flows, depends on that flow of nature's benefits into our business model. So the resilience of nature really underpins the resilience of the cash flow and future cash flow generating capacity of a business, which of course is of principal concern to a board, to the management, and of course also to investors. So there's a lot there to unpack. So let's start taking apart a couple of the key concepts that you've usefully put out for us. Maybe a quick follow-up question for you, Cynthia. In this context, and you talked about information that's reasonably available to the directors and to the business. Of course, one related important issue there is the issue on the principle of materiality. And of course, not least in Europe at the moment, where they've put into black and white law the notion of double materiality and CSRD. But there are other approaches to materiality, as we know, including the IFRS's focus on investor materiality specifically. Of course, at TNFD, we've taken the approach of treating TNFD as a tool that can work for different materiality approaches. But what's your sense about how these different approaches should be playing out in the corporate boardroom, in the discussions that board directors should be having? And then we can get perspectives from Helle and Sarah about what's actually happening in the boardroom today. But how does the concept of materiality play into how directors should be thinking about these things and having that discussion amongst themselves?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that question. Material information is fundamentally economically significant information. The definition in the United States from the U.S. Supreme Court is information a reasonable investor is likely to consider significant in the total mix of information available. And that is likely to be information that has an implication of some sort for the future cash flows of a business. Now, and that is sometimes called financial materiality. It's sometimes in today's world called, single materiality. What you are seeing in Europe developing is sometimes called impact materiality, sometimes called double materiality. And that is a question about what is the effect of a company's actions on the natural world. And to use an example, assume you are a water company and you are bottling water and you are advertising that your water comes from a specific source. If the aquifer was becoming depleted or polluted, that would be economically significant information likely to have an effect on the company, raising its costs, possibly, reducing its sales. So that would be single materiality information. If it is the company's actions that are causing the aquifer to become depleted and thus pollution will, by definition, have, a higher percentage within the water, that would be double materiality, the effect of the company's actions on the natural world. Now, I understand what should the conversations be. 900 non-EU companies are going to be required to disclose information according to the EU's Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. And those are specifically the world's largest companies with 450 million euros of economic output from the EU or in the EU. So double materiality, impact materiality discussions are starting to happen, and companies are trying to come to terms with what that means for their internal analysis. What data do they need now to be developing for their disclosure, which will be in the next 2 to 3 years? I understand from lawyers in the United States advising boards that there is something of a wait and see attitude at the moment. Climate is understood now, and companies are coming to terms with measuring their greenhouse gas emissions. One last point, one last thing that I've heard is that some companies in the United States think that nature impacts and dependencies are much more subjective than greenhouse gas emissions. So I think one of the challenges for the TNFD and others in this space are to develop the metrics that are clearly not only subjective.
Yeah, no, it's a great point. And we hear this argument all the time. People are overwhelmed with climate. There's quite a lot of institutional capability around climate today. Obviously, a lot of companies and financial institutions have invested in that capability. This rest of nature discussion, if I can put it that way, because of course climate change is just part of the broader nature gender. It's not separate, despite the fact that we have these two separate buckets. These other nature-related issues are fairly new. The TNFD has just 10 days ago issued our first batch of sector guidance and sector metrics. And of course, in our core recommendations published last year, there are also now metrics there. So hopefully we can address this perception. I think it's a bit misplaced at this stage that nature is more subjective. Of course, it's not a single unit of measurement like CO2. Some of it isn't as easy to quantify. But back to the notion of material issues and information that boards should reasonably have, what we're hearing from pilot testers of TNFD and early reporters is there's plenty of information that can be decision useful for boards and also for investors in assessing these nature-related issues. So thank you for that point. Sarah, can I bring you in now? And first of all, thank you for staying up so late in Australia. It's a heroic effort, but we're really delighted to have you with us. You've been a board director. You've been advising boards on climate issues and climate mitigation risks for many, many years. As Cynthia said, we're now starting to see regulatory action with things like CSRD, but also greenwashing cases, including in Australia where you are, which has now resulted in green hushing as well by companies, right? So we're starting to see people do the internal homework, but really very reluctant to make any statements, certainly any forward-looking statements. So can you build on Cynthia's comments around this sort of reasonable information that's reasonably available? What is the sort of standard or the test for the extent to which boards and directors need to go to in order to demonstrate they've done their homework, they've looked at this issue satisfactorily or these issues satisfactorily and to a sufficient sort of standard of due diligence? Can you sort of help us understand how that's articulated and how boards can understand how far they need to go to be satisfied on these issues?
I might answer the last question first, the first question in the middle, and then go back to the last question, if I may, because there's quite a bit in there to unpack, Tony. So to start with, unfortunately, if you're thinking about what is the formula that directors need to apply to go tick, I have done my job, I have demonstrated that we have reasonable grounds for this assessment, it's really how long is a piece of string. And even the definition of what reasonable grounds are refers back to what would a reasonable person think is sufficient in the circumstances. But I think that actually comes back to a really good point, which is in this area, there is no substitute for board members having functional fluency in this area, understanding it, having their capacity built, and then critically evaluating what comes before them. It actually requires them to actively apply their independent judgment, and there's just no substitute for that, particularly given the complexity and uncertainty. So going back to greenwashing and green hushing. Now, there is no law around the world that actually says thou shalt not greenwash. It's a bit of a shorthand that we use for misleading disclosure in an environmentally related context. So whether we are underrepresenting the extent of nature-related risks for our business, or overstating our green credentials or our capacity to manage those risks. Now, unfortunately, with the rise of both strategic litigation and regulatory attention on environmentally related representations, there has been a lot more litigation. And with that has come a lot more fear of being sued. And particularly, it's difficult in the face of so much complexity and uncertainty in this area. So often where you are being advised by corporate lawyers who don't have experience in sustainability, the default response is, oh no, that's all risky, let's not say anything so we don't get sued, which is called green hushing, as you've identified. Yeah. But green hushing is both legally and commercially imprudent. So legally it is imprudent because, as Cynthia mentioned, so many nature-related dependencies and impacts are material financial risks and opportunities over short-term, medium-term, long-term time horizons. So you then have to be communicating those to your investors. And if you don't, you are misrepresenting a material financial issue for your company. And so that's led, even just recently, the chair of the Securities Commission here in Australia, ASIC, Joe Lungo, said, look, green hushing is just another form of greenwashing, because you're misrepresenting what is a material financial risk and opportunity for your business. But we also know that it's commercially imprudent. And it's commercially imprudent because these are issues that your investors, whether they're debt or equity, that your customers, that your stakeholders are concerned about, they care about. They change their purchasing and investment decisions based on how they understand where you're exposed and how you're managing these risks. So both legally and commercially, it is really imprudent to green hush. I'm conscious of time, but I'll very quickly jump on one of the areas that directors struggle with in this area, which is forward-looking statements, and particularly where you've got things like net positive targets, like net zero targets before them. They are forward-looking statements, and the law imposes particularly acute standards on disclosures that are made about things that are going to occur into the future. There's a recognition that we don't have a crystal ball. No one's going to be held to a crystal ball, but we at least have to be making educated predictions rather than just, finger in the air, I reckon this will happen. And so that's where we're held to. Can you demonstrate at the time you made the representation that you had reasonable grounds to support this question or to support this representation? That's where directors struggle, because nature is so complex, because it is so uncertain. It requires judgment. So that's where it's really incumbent on sustainability teams, finance teams, management, and the board to really get across these issues and to understand the range of future states, where the complexity lies, where the uncertainty lies, and to disclose the assumptions, dependencies, caveats, and uncertainties that are associated with a piece of information that you're disclosing in that context.
Fantastic. Hello, Sarah's just introduced this important notion of functional fluency. You're in the business of trying to teach boards and non-executive directors and others on these new emerging topics that need their attention. What's your sense of the current level of understanding in the market today around nature-related issues? I know you've started doing board trainings, but you've been doing climate-related issues for much longer. Maybe give us a sense of sort of a temperature check on your sense of board level understanding around these emerging new nature-related issues.
Thanks so much, first of all, for having me here, and Sarah and Cynthia. Brilliant comments. So, Tony, I think if you look at all of those that we at Competent Boards upskill and train, so we now in over 55 countries, and probably those that comes to Competent Boards are those that want to have that insight, want to have that foresight, that understand that we need to skate where the puck is going, to use a good Canadian Wayne Gretzky, and not just stay where we are. But I also want to take a little bit back, because often what I find is that we look at it as, oh, this is what's going to happen in the boardroom or in the company. But us as human beings, yes, I'm an accountant. Yes, I'm a business lawyer. But right now, and if I could have shared it, I would, but it's on my LinkedIn. Yesterday, I saw what I thought was an orca, a whale, killer whale. It was not an orca, it was a humpback whale, but I shared it on my LinkedIn. If you look at leaders, leaders love nature. I mean, some of them play golf. Some of them go on a bike ride like me. Some of them go hiking like me. Some of them go diving like me. And so it's not that we don't understand until somehow when we get into the boardroom and we look at what are all of our results that we need to reach. And that's where I think when we get people into the competent boards classroom, or and they talk to other leaders and they understand what are both the risk but also the opportunities that other leaders have faced. So we have one of our faculty, so we have including your chair as faculty, but one of the other of the faculty share this story about the little red flamingo. This company used ton of money for a new site, and then someone came and said, but if you start building there, the little red flamingo is not going to be here anymore. And the board had that discussion and decided not to go ahead with that project. And often it's a question about us not knowing. And that's why I say, well, you can't see it, but I'm pointing to the chair next to me. What would nature say if we have nature around that boardroom table?
Yeah.
And I think that's for me the most important thing. How do we bring that understanding? And that's what I see when I see people from all around the world joining us as the programs, both in climate and nature, because we combine it. That is to get that mindset and understand that this is not only business. This is both business and nature combined. And we like it or not, nature can survive without us, right? And business cannot survive without nature.
Without nature, yeah. And you make a great point about nature as a sort of silent stakeholder, which is a concept I think has been around for a long time, but it's quite powerful but easily forgotten. But also Partha Dasgupta, who wrote the Dasgupta Review, says most of nature is silent, invisible, and mobile. And of course, those three characteristics are very, very difficult for us to manage as a source of potential risk. And so I think to your point, we've got to draw on our innate connection to nature and bring that more into the boardroom as a place to start the conversation.
Yeah, but Tony, think about it. Nature is not that silent anymore. Think about all invoices.
Yeah.
Think about the externalities. Think about insurance companies. I don't think there are a lot of companies that don't have a premium that's going up. The D&O insurance, who have looked at their D&O insurance lately. So it is, like it or not, entering into both the boardroom, into the businesses.
Yeah.
And what I'm trying to do with our programs is to get people to open their eyes and ears and understand that and see that we actually we've taken so much for granted, right?
Yes. Yeah.
And that's where we need to understand. And that's, by starting pricing the externalities, we start putting a price on nature.
Very good. Sarah, I want to come back to you. And Cynthia mentioned this work in her opening comments. You both of you have been involved in the Commonwealth Climate and Law Initiative, which has recently produced, I think, very, very important, very insightful legal opinions around directors' duties and nature. Of course, these are not legal cases, they're legal opinions. But can you maybe walk us through the key elements of what's in those opinions? What do they say? What are the implications? What does this mean for boards and director responsibilities in relation to nature issues?
Yeah, sure. And if I could trouble Clarissa to pull up the slides for my deck for here, Tony. Thank you. I would love to take credit for these opinions, but I have the beautiful honour as a director of CCLI and managing director at Pollination Law to be able to sworn in after the team has done all the great work and be able to talk about them. So if you go to the next slide, actually Cindy talked about AI and cyber. We hadn't thought about that 10 years ago. Who knew what a QR code was? 5 years ago. I'm feeling very jiggy and millennial today because I've actually managed to insert some QR codes so people can actually access these opinions. So CCLI, in combination with Pollination Law, late last year in Australia and early this year in the UK, commissioned legal opinions by eminent King's Counsel. And we asked them a very, very simple question. And the question was, looking at the issue of nature-related dependencies and impact for business, what do companies, boards of directors have to do, and what are they permitted to do under their fiduciary and statutory duties? And so if we go to the next slide, I have summarised, because I know that this audience is global, not everyone is in Australia or England and Wales, summarised what the key principles that we can pull from these opinions are. First of all, nature is no longer unlimited and free. Nature-related dependencies and impacts give rise to foreseeable and often material financial risks and opportunities for companies over short-term, medium-term and long-term. So the next principle is that directors therefore can and actually often must turn their minds to nature-related impacts and dependencies. Because at a minimum, if you are a director who is duty-bound to pursue the best interests of your company, even if you take the shareholder primacist approach, and I should say I'm a shareholder primacist, it's all about money for me. I'm a corporate lawyer. Money, 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 yeah. Even if you are a shareholder primacist, at a minimum, you are duty-bound to consider the financial nature of nature-related risks and opportunities. More broadly, it's necessary for proper business management, and a failure to turn your mind to those issues is increasingly likely to breach your duty to pursue the best interest of your corporation through a purely financial lens. And the third conclusion is about then, well, what do we have to do? If we have to think about it, what does that mean? And this comes back to the point of diligence that Cindy raised in her introductory points as well. So this is where directors have to have that functional fluency and actively apply their independent judgment to these issues in the same way as they would any other foreseeable financial risk or opportunity. You turn your mind to those foreseeable risks. You make a judgment about which are material. You oversee management's approach to managing those risks. You integrate the corollaries into strategy and strategic planning, and you consider how those material issues need to be disclosed. So 3 very, very simple points coming out of those legal opinions. And I should say, even though that's new, as a matter of legal principle, this is not controversial. This is no new law. It's a recognition of the evolution of markets and what is financially material, and the application to very, very well-established principles of law. And very quickly, Clarissa, if you do go to the last slide, because I was really getting into the technology, I've got a QR code there linked to the list that Cindy put up there before, which is also a CCLI publication in conjunction with the Climate Governance Initiative, where we turned our minds to biodiversity. And if you have only a very limited bandwidth to give to a reluctant board as to why they have a legal obligation to look at these issues, I can commend this publication to you. And the final page has the questions that Cindy put up on the screen before.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Sarah. I want to start bringing in some of the questions from the audience, if I can. Maybe the first one to you, Helle. There's a couple of questions around how do we, if you're in a management team or you're a nature lead or a biodiversity analyst in a company and you're aware of the issues, I think there's a general sense, we hear this a lot at TNFD, that it's just really hard to get senior executive attention and board level attention. So do you have any advice on how corporate executives who get this and see the material issues can maybe be more effective at raising this up to the senior leadership of the organization to get more attention? Have you seen any sort of successful ways of doing that? Because this is a recurring sense of frustration.
Exactly. And I think one is to use the tools we have, the enterprise risk management system. How do we get these things into the risk register? If we look at the value chain of a company and we look at, are we able to actually get supply that we need for the products we have today in a few years' time? Not only in terms of from a biodiversity point of view, but also from a nature point of view, are we under threat on different things? Basically we have AI, we have a lot of other technologies that actually can help us see where are the risk to that value chain, to the products that we make. You can go and talk to your insurance providers and ask what are they seeing, and I'm quite sure that will get a few ears around the boardroom table as well. And then, as I say, I think this is a question about language. When we have board directors, business leaders that are part of the competent boards programs, they listen very carefully, both to the risks and to, what are they, like the late Ray Anderson said, in the future, people like me will go to jail. It's not that long ago. Now you're starting to see that. And of course, there's that fear, what can happen? But there's also this understanding of, oh, I was not really aware of all of this. How do we deal with this? And this is not only for self and their children, etc. It's also when you start talking to your employees. It's when you start talking to your customers, when you start talking to those from the bank that is going to finance you. So I think we are right now in a session where it can be a little bit difficult to get the ears because there's a lot of other things. But if you use the right language, if you have the right examples, I can promise you're going to get the ear of the board. Otherwise, call me and I make sure.
Yeah, and I think to your point about insurance premiums and things, I think we're seeing people now presenting the evidence of how nature is. We talk about these transition mechanisms from impacts and dependencies. Dependencies is really the pathway to risk to the organization. And if you have a dependence on water or you have a dependence on the health of an ecosystem because you're in a bushfire prone area, for example, we're already seeing these risks transmit their way through to the financials of an organization. Insurance premiums is an obvious one. And in some parts of the world now, insurers won't provide insurance coverage. So there's actually a really imminent risk of stranded assets, which of course is sort of worst case scenario. So I think you're right. It's about assembling that kind of evidence and presenting that to senior leadership and the board to help make the case.
And if I'm just may on that one, think about the audit committee as well. Some of these things we're talking about now should actually get into, if it's the 10K or if the annual report, whatever, we should actually be in there at the moment. And if you start asking those questions and also talk to your auditors about it, again, you're going to start understanding that this is not something in 10 years' time. This is something we need to identify now and start to manage and care about.
I want to come back to you, Cynthia, with another question. Actually, one of the last questions asked, it was about whether the principles that Sarah just shared, how you see those applying outside of Commonwealth jurisdictions. Clearly, the illegal opinions, I think New Zealand, Australia, and the UK have all produced an illegal opinion around nature and directors' duties. But can you just, and you talked about the US jurisdiction in your comments. So I think, Sarah, you were projecting them as globally relevant insights, irrespective of the type of legal construct in the jurisdiction. But Cynthia, maybe you can say more about sort of the global nature of this challenge ahead and how it applies in different contexts.
Yes, thank you. The CCLI has worked with the Climate Governance Initiative of the World Economic Forum and has looked at fiduciary duties for climate and increasingly for nature across 30 jurisdictions and the EU. And these duties, fiduciary duties of care, prudence, and loyalty, are remarkably consistent across jurisdictions. They come about from, 13th century agency law. Agents have duties to their principal. And in the corporate law context, the principal is the corporation, and the agents are the directors and officers. In the pension fund context, the principal is the body of money and the potential beneficiaries, right? So disclosure obligations are quite jurisdictional specific, but fiduciary duties cross jurisdictions and are very consistent across jurisdictions. Even civil law, as I said at the outset, versus common law. And CCLI has done an in-depth analysis in the United States, which is not a Commonwealth country, but is a common law country,
Right.
based on UK law. For any of your US audience members, I would say, please, go to our website, commonwealthclimatelaw.org, and look at the U.S. opinion, which we are in the process of updating. It was a 2021 opinion, process of updating, and we'll be relaunching later this year.
Fantastic. And Sarah, another question for you from the audience. A question about whether it's the same approach, the same mindset, the same standard for financial institutions as it is for companies. Of course, it's real world companies that have the direct impacts on the ground or in the oceans or on the freshwater natural assets as well. But how does this look for the requirements of a financial institution? You've obviously been a director of a pension fund yourself.
and this is the issue: banks, pension funds, universal investors. So the direct exposure is relatively low, a few buildings here and there, but the indirect exposure is economy wide. And so the questions that you need to ask are very, very different. So you're asking questions around how, for each sector to which we lend, how are we confident that, particularly in an institutional and corporate sense, that our borrowers have themselves done the analysis about their dependencies and impacts, et cetera, et cetera. A little bit harder when you've got very diffuse portfolios, like, for example, agricultural or residential real estate, where you've got a lot of very, very small borrowers. But like we did with climate and banks with their net zero banking alliance targets, we need to understand that the exposure is indirect and in the portfolio. And as a universal investor, we need the entire water level to rise. We need to ensure that everyone in our portfolio is understanding these risks and managing them. Otherwise, it will have financial impacts and systemic financial impact. I noticed that in the chat before there was popped in the publication of the Network for Greening of Financial Services, which is the peak environmental body of central banks, who has published a study on nature-related litigation risks. So these are systemic financial issues, and certainly the questions that directors of financial institutions need to ask are different, but geez, they're just as important, if not more so. Yeah,
great. And so maybe the questions are slightly different, but the responsibility is not different, even if a portfolio manager or a lender might obviously have a very different business model. Just related to that, Sarah, one of the issues, of course, with climate is that the companies have a direct impact, but of course, for many, it's in their supply chain and sort of scope 3 emissions, and a lot of people are finding that very hard to get a fix on. It's the same thing with nature, particularly also, of course, for financial institutions. So as we talk about financed emissions, TNFD, we've started to talk about financed impacts. But whether it's a company a long way down the supply chain, maybe it's a grocery retailer, or it's a food and beverage manufacturer, they might have tens of thousands of suppliers and very complex supply chains. What's your advice either for a financial institution financing impacts or big companies with long supply chains? How do they get started, and are they able to get started looking at their direct impacts and say, well, we're working on looking at our supply chain impacts, but it's going to take us some time to get there? Is that a sort of satisfactory answer for the market, and does that meet your obligations as a board? And how do you manage these complexities around supply chains?
Oh, you're asking a lot of questions with a lot in them, Tony. Geez, how long do we have?
And I'm asking them to you at 11:30 at night in Australia.
And you're asking them to me, it's nearly midnight as well. I think, practically, we can't eat the elephant. You've got to start nibbling a toenail. So to me, sorry, Cindy, that was probably a really uncouth analogy, but you know what I mean. The very first thing I say to all my corporate clients and the boards is start with capacity building. Start with understanding, well, what are nature-related dependencies and impacts, and how can they cause financial risks and opportunities? And then we can go from there and say, okay, are we going to do a bottom-up or a top-down? Are we going to start, are we going to pick a particular product or service and follow it through the entire supply chain and do it that way and extrapolate from there? Or are we going to start within our four walls and go from there? And this is where, Tony, I think it was probably a really good point at which you should be giving a plug to the LEAP framework under the TNFD as a really useful framework that companies can use when they're getting started to actually understand where our what are our impacts and dependencies, where are they located, evaluating them, analysing them, etc., etc.
Yeah, great. Well, I'll thank you for the plug on LEAP. Obviously, I think as TNFD, we would point out that not only have we provided a set of recommended disclosures, but also the assessment tools to help people figure that out. So the sort of internal work that needs to be done. And we know that hundreds of companies around the world are working on doing a LEAP assessment. They might not be telling anyone about it. Of course, that's great. We just want people to use the tools and start figuring out these issues. But we know a lot of people are using and starting to get working on a LEAP assessment, even if they're not saying anything outside the walls of the building, which is fine. And it brings us back to this point about building confidence through building capability. Helle, I wanted to come back to you. In your work with boards, of course, we hear that everyone's planning to build on their climate capability and sort of extend that out across these other aspects of nature. Do you think that's a good approach for board directors to kind of upskill their existing directors? Obviously, that needs to happen. But are you also seeing evidence of, and do you think there's a case for boards to bring in other types of people with other types of background, maybe ecologists and biologists and hydrologists? Do you see this evolving where the composition of boards and the skill sets that are brought into boards is going to change over time?
This is a very good question. And we are in a situation right now where if we should have a climate expert, we should have a nature expert, we should have a human rights expert, we should have an AI expert. We could have a lot of experts around the boardroom table, which means that we would look at that person on whatever question we are talking about. I rather have that we upskill the board of directors, we upskill the leadership to understand all of this. And then we bring in advisors, we bring in some experts to have some very concrete discussions. But we need everyone, and Cynthia, you said it so right, we need everyone to not only be able to ask the questions, but also to know what does good look like. Because at the moment we have a lot of, my book, Stewards of the Future, full of, here are the questions to ask. There's plenty of questions out there. But if you don't know what good looks like, then you're just tick mark. I asked the questions. That's not good enough anymore. You need to have that understanding of what can we do. And that's where I find that learning from each other, this peer-to-peer learning that we are doing, right? Where you start learning from each other, you start understanding what is possible out there. That's part of that upskilling. That's part of that having that foresight that you really need nowadays. You thinking about what was good a few years ago, forget it. You need to understand what is happening at the moment. When we have Johan Rockström talking about, the planetary boundary, when with David Gregg, talking about what is it that you need to start looking at in your value chain, your supply chain. That's where I see for all of the leaders joining, that they get that insight, they get that foresight, so they can provide oversight. And at the end of the day, we're going to judge them. The world is going to judge us all, right?
Yeah.
But have you provided that oversight? Did you ask the questions? Did you understand what the responses were?
Yeah.
Did make an informed decisions? And you can't make informed decisions if you're not informed.
Right. Yeah. And back to this idea of functional fluency, and everyone can start with the LEAP guidance and the content on our website if they don't know where else to begin. But I think we'll wrap up with a final question. I might bring it back to you, Cynthia. There's an interesting question in the chat around, and I'm going to slightly adapt it, but referring to this notion of a legal personhood for nature. We've seen a legal status for whales. We've also seen the UN introduce this right to a clean environment. So just if we zoom right back out again and look at the next, say, 5 to 10 years, how do you think the sort of shifting consumer expectations, or sorry, not consumer, but shifting public expectations and these sort of new legal instruments at a macro level might then shift the notion of fiduciary duty further and then bring nature more into this discussion through notions of legal rights and things like that? We'll welcome your final reflections at a sort of macro level, looking out over 5 to 10 years.
Well, I think that's a great way to conclude, because you are right. In multiple jurisdictions, a number in South America, in India, and elsewhere, nature is being given its own specific rights, which then means there is a greater ability for litigants to get standing to assert nature's rights. We have not talked about litigation risk, but there is, increasingly energetic global communication among litigants, and multiple ways that litigation is going forward to cause companies to pay attention, if they are not willing to pay attention to nature or climate as risks and opportunities to their strategies going forward. And I would also quickly like to say, it's understood that between $12 and $30 trillion is going to be inherited over the next 15 to 20 years by younger generations. And in these surveys show consistently that these are people who care about these issues, and their views are not, shifting towards more conservative financial views as maybe our generations did. So consumers, investors, litigants, these are all reasons that companies should care, but the fundamental reason is that this is important information for the strategy and success of the company going forward.
Amazing. So I think the key takeaways for me for this conversation is nature's already a material risk issue for companies and financial institutions. No need to treat it any differently from cyber risk, for example, which is a new issue that no board, frankly, would be wanting to be caught short on today. And they need to be thinking about nature, I think, in the same mindset. And to your final point there, Cynthia, the landscape is very dynamic around the notion of financial fiduciary responsibilities and expectations on companies now, as well as financial institutions. And so we can reasonably expect this is going to continue to evolve very, very fast over the next couple of years. So I'll hand back to Candice to wrap up. We've reached the top of the hour, but first of all, let me just say a huge thanks to our three panelists. It's been a very rich discussion. I'm sure we could go on for another hour, but we'll let Sarah go to bed in Australia. But thank you very, very much for joining us.
What an incredible panel, and thank you again. I feel like we've just had an hour of free legal advice, but it certainly feels like it's a critical topic that for me is linked to, thanks to all your participation as questions. I'd like to just reference the fact there have been a number of really helpful links shared in the Q&A. We will be following up with references to some of those links following the call as well. And then hopefully you're also able to catch some of Sarah's very clever QR codes. So we'll also include those, Sarah. Thank you. They haven't gone wasted. And certainly following up on today's webinar with a follow-up email. Thank you again for joining. It's been an unbelievable hour and hopefully many more to come. We have a TNFD in a box board level overview material, which you can also access on our website. So please don't fail to have a look at our website for some really, really supportive material. And thank you very much. We look forward to you joining our forum and our next webinar. Thank you very much and have a good rest of your day, everyone. Goodbye.
Clarissa, please do let us know if you've closed the call.
Unfortunately, if I close the webinar, we'll all be kicked out.
We'll all be out. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, we can. We'll just say a quick thank you to all of you. I can still see there's like 50 people online, but thank you to all three of you. Terrific discussion, and we'll follow up by email in the next couple of days. Thanks again.
Well, thank you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Bye for now.
Thanks.
Bye.
Good night, Sarah.
Good night, Sarah.